kick off, and I'm sure more people. Hello all, good morning. My name is Deb Myhoff with Communitas. I'm the facilitator for the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis Project for the Housing Actions Work Group, the HOG. This is our third meeting for those keeping track. Really glad you're all here. We have a full agenda, but also adequate time. We'll be going until about noon today, and we'll have a break in the midst of that, and we'll try to get it well timed. But of course, as always, if you need to take a break before we get to the official break time, you should definitely do that. And I believe you all know how to work the HOG if you're having, or work the HOG, work the Zoom. But if you're having any sort of technical troubles or troubles getting audio or signing in, Casaria Taylor is your resource today. Please message her in the chat, and she'll try to troubleshoot with you and connect with the rest of us if she needs some additional help. And I will go over the agenda here in a moment. I did not talk to the team about whether they have a slide with the agenda, so I guess I'll ask them now. Okay, you want to go ahead and queue up the slide deck and we can get going. Without further ado, glad everyone's here. So this morning, as always, we'll go over the agenda. We'll talk about the racial equity framework. Staff will have some pointers about portions of that racial equity framework that are particularly relevant to our discussion today. We will be continuing the conversation on, or sort of advancing the conversation on adoption-ready actions, and the adoption-ready action framework and definition, talk about some potential revisions, get your feedback on that. We'll also then be talking about how adoption-ready actions work in the context of compliance framework for the housing production strategy and the housing acceleration program, part of housing planning. And then we'll speak more specifically about compliance pathway framework for action selection. And as I mentioned, there'll be a break in there. I have it roughly, the slide says 11:50 to 11 o'clock, which is an interesting time warp. Sometimes we feel like we're in a time warp, but it'll be somewhere around 11 o'clock. We'll take a break. Any questions about the agenda before we get cranking here? Okay, great. And just as a reminder, as we get into discussion, it's very helpful if you're capable to turn on a camera, because this is also being recorded. You can watch it later, but also other people are tuning in live. It's nice to know where the voices are coming from when you're on YouTube. You don't always I'll try to make sure to fill in your names, but it's not always clear who's talking without a visual. So just request that. With that, I am going to hand it over to, oh, sorry, I should do a quick round of introductions of staff that are a project team that are in the room. There's quite a few of us here this morning. I think what I'll do is hand it to Thea to kick us off. Could you popcorn at DLCD staff, and then I'll introduce some of the other consultants in the room, and then we'll get going.
You bet. Thank you so much, Deb, and thank you all for being here today and spending your time working on this with us. I'm Thea Croman. I am a housing planner with the department and helping to lead the work of the HOG along with my colleagues, and I'll pass it over to Celestina.
Thanks, Thea. Good morning, everybody. Celestina Teva, she and they pronouns. Also a housing planner here at Department of Land Conservation and Development. And I will hand it over to Maria Valencia Aguilar.
Morning, everyone. Maria Valencia Aguilar, she or they pronouns, housing planner here with the department. I'll hand it over to Ethan.
Hey everyone, sorry about that. Ethan Stockmeyer. I'm the manager of the housing division at DLCD. Let's see, I think we've got, I'm gonna go back to you, Deb.
Okay. Yeah, that's all good. We have
Okay.
a couple of visitors. Kirsten, would you mind introducing yourself?
Sure, thanks. We also have Joel Madsen with the Housing Accountability Protection Office. So good morning, everyone. I'm Kirsten Green. I serve as the agency's Deputy Director and Tribal Liaison at the Director's Delegation. And really glad to just follow along and support where I can. Thank you. Over to Joel.
Good morning, everyone. Joel Matson, I use he, him pronouns. I'm the Housing Accountability and Production Office Manager.
Thanks, Joel. And Josh, you're a member of the HOG, but also a member of DLCD. Would you mind introducing yourself?
I'm Josh LeBombard. I'm the Southern Oregon regional rep for the department and also lead regional rep for the department.
Wonderful. Thank you. I think that's it for DLCD. If not, I'll circle back, but I'll keep us moving here.
Sorry, Deb, we do have Casaria.
Oh,
Did we
yeah,
already
I'm
have-
sorry. Thank you. Yes, I had mentioned her at the beginning, but
Yeah.
thank you. Casaria, please introduce yourself.
Hi, good morning. Casaria Taylor. I'm the Senior Rules Coordinator for the agency. I'll be filling in for Ingrid this meeting and also your next meeting.
Really glad you're here, Casaria. Thank you so much. All right, so Lorelai, if you could introduce yourself from the consultant team.
Sure, thanks, Deb. Got a little bit of a cold.
Oh,
Lorelai Jensen, good to see you all here today with Echo Northwest. We've been providing support to the DLCD team, and maybe I'll kick it to Becky next.
Hi, Becky Hewitt with Echo Northwest. Just supported Celestina and Thea through some of the material they're going to present and wanted to hear the conversation. Thanks.
and Madeline.
Hi, everyone. I'm Madeline Miller with Echo Northwest. I'm a senior project manager and one of the main coordinators on the project. I'll be taking notes today.
Thanks, Madeline. And last but not least on the support team is Commissioner Alan Lazo. Alan, would you mind introducing yourself?
Yeah, good morning, everyone. I'm Alan Lazo. I'm the Vice Chair of Land Conservation Development Commission. I use he, him pronouns.
Thanks, Alan. Glad you're here today. All right, we have a good group of support, and obviously there are a number of committee members or work group members here as well. I am going to keep us moving along. I believe Celestina is in charge this morning of outlining the racial equity framework, but maybe it's Thea, sorry.
No worries. We've switched back and forth a few times. So yeah, I'd like to keep it fresh. So I just wanted to take a minute to reground us all in the racial equity framework for decision making that was adopted by our commission to help guide much of the work of the agency and including importantly the rulemaking effort. Today we wanted to sort of highlight a couple of areas, although many of these areas apply deeply to the questions that we're going to be working through today. We wanted to pull out these two areas to sort of walk through the prompts that to help us get in the frame of mind to ensure that we're being responsive. So both benefits and burdens and accountability. Maddie, if you want to go to the next slide. So when we're thinking about benefits and burdens, there's a sort of helpful set of questions when we're applying this framework to rulemaking. So what are the benefits and the burdens of this rule? Financial, environmental, and social. Who will benefit from this action and who will be most burdened? How will the burdens be mitigated? And how might the benefits be redistributed? We're directed to identify possible unintended consequences and think about how we would mitigate these if we find them later. And finally, to analyze and consider benefits and burdens to future populations in Oregon. When we're thinking about accountability and creating a framework that holds us all accountable to the outcomes that we're charged with trying to create, trying to come into. These are the prompts that we are helpful for us to think about. So how does this rule address accountability measures for both DLCD and local governments? What are the accountability measures for local government in this rule? How will DLCD track compliance? And what are the incentives and disincentives for not meeting that compliance? Do the accountability measures include engaging with communities? So if yes, how's this done? And if no, why? And finally, what are the challenges and opportunities for accountability for DLCD and local government? And what are some ideas to address this? And we'll really be digging into a lot of these questions in the second half of our meeting today. So with that sort of as our baseline, we can go on to the next slide. Deb, I don't know if you wanted to provide any transition, or I can just kind of jump in.
No, please go right ahead.
Okay, super. So last meeting, we discussed the concept of adoption-ready actions in the Goal 10 housing planning context. So how they can best be developed to support local governments. And the intention of this work is to build out a set of actions that can minimize capacity burden, and increase opportunities for local governments to really take impactful steps toward their housing targets. Mari, you can go to the next slide. So our robust conversation and exercise last month, along with really broad-ranging research and engagement with interested parties, really provided a jumping off point for the process of operationalizing the statutory direction. And as we began to evaluate the many possibilities for ARAs that emerged from this work over the past week and beyond, it really became clear that the working definition that we had introduced last month was not entirely accurate. And meaningfully, the description of ARAs in the previous working definition as immediately actionable, regardless of context, in reality, limited the field of possibilities to only a few and quite narrow actions. So the revised and still working definition, which is here, acknowledges the value of adoption-ready actions that have varying levels of adoption readiness. And so I'll just read the definition. So the revised working definition is adoption-ready action means an action that is partially or fully developed and implementable. An adoption-ready action is designed to reduce development resource needs while supporting the principles of Goal 10 housing. An adoption-ready action requires some elements of universal applicability, but the level of adoption readiness may vary. So ultimately, this new definition acknowledges that context matters, and that the majority of actions require some level of local analysis in order to be applicable. So given that understanding, and with the help of good folks at Echo Northwest, we developed a framework to begin to organize and evaluate potential ARAs. We can go to the next slide, Maddie. So very basically, we've established a sort of 3-level framework for adoption-ready actions. Level 1 refers to actions that are partially developed, but require a fair amount of local preparation. So the ARA would likely include like a packet of materials, so like sample ordinance language, guidance, and legal documents. And this level kind of encompasses the widest range of actions and some of the most impactful actions, and it allows DLCD to sort of take on some substantial responsibility for the development of actions that really can be applicable in the local context and very impactful in the local context, but can't just be plopped down without an understanding of sort of the nuance and the context that it's being applied in. So an example here would be like a model RFP for land development for affordable housing. and sort of the documents and documentation that goes along with that. Level 2 is largely developed and standardized, but acknowledges that some amount of local contextualization and sensitivity testing will be necessary and required, so as not to like incur unintended consequences. An example here would be like a model SDC policy for multi-unit housing development. Level 3 indicates that the action is, in fact, fully developed and immediately implementable. So given the criteria, which we're going to talk about next, a level 3 action must be developed to sort of this peak level of readiness. And this level represents a smaller selection of actions overall, largely model code. An example of this would be like model code for multi-unit housing standards. We can move to the next slide, Maddie. So what do those criteria actually look like? I don't think anything in these criteria, which you also saw in the memo that we sent out, are surprising or controversial, but I think you'll notice that together they kind of set a high bar for actions that are actually right for development into adoption-ready actions. So don't want to take too much time, but we can walk through this list so we all are sort of on the same page about this. So an adoption-ready action should be aligned in that the action is or can be targeted toward addressing a relevant housing need or a policy outcome. It should be legal under current Oregon state law. It should be local, so it needs to be one that a jurisdiction can take action on, as opposed to the state or a developer. It should be sort of evidence-based and proven to be effective, and in particular, to have a measurable income on the intended outcome. It needs to be applicable across a wide range of jurisdictions throughout Oregon. It needs to be durable. So it needs to be able to be used based on a template to some extent, at least to some extent. And it needs to be valuable. So it needs to truly reduce the cost or capacity investment that a local government needs to put into it. Over all of these, it needs to be responsive to key housing needs. So it needs to be focused on the types, characteristics, and location of the housing that it's supporting the development of. We can move to the next slide. So in addition to that, those criteria and the key housing needs, of course, we need to tie it back to the HOG policy objectives. So just to remind us where those are and what this program is sort of aimed at: promote inclusive zoning to enable a diversity of housing options, produce and retrofit homes in high opportunity areas that increase housing choice, related to equity-driven needs, streamline housing development processes, and increase community capacity and resilience in support of equitable housing production. So those need to be encompassed in any of the ARAs that we develop to adoption readiness. Finally, go to the next slide. Just to bring this back up, it also needs to be tied to the racial equity framework, to be guided by the questions in each of these sections. And so these are sort of all of our guiding principles. Together, they allow us to, I think, develop a pretty focused set of ARAs that intend to accomplish the things that we're setting out to do in this rulemaking process. So with that sort of as background, Deb, I will hand it back to you to get us into a conversation about ARAs, about the framework, and how we're evaluating it.
That's great. Thank you so much for the brief overview. I am putting in the chat right now a link to the agenda packet with the materials in case you're having a moment where it's difficult to put your finger on it. So just bringing that up because the memos will help us in the discussion and provide some of that background as well. So let's get going on providing some feedback on the adoption ready actions and definition refinement. Before we get into discussion, are there any questions about anything Thea just presented or anything you saw in the packet of information that we need to clarify before we discuss content?
Just a quick question. Should we reserve these larger dialogues for our discussion rather than kind of jumping into some of the minutia of the framework right now?
Sure. Yeah, that's fine. Thank you for asking. Michael.
That's an excellent point. But I was wondering if you have any guidance on weighing the framework against the status quo too, because it seems like choosing not to decide is also making a choice. Choosing not to change anything is also making a choice. How do you think about that issue?
Yeah, great question. Anyone at DLCD want to take that?
Just to say, I think that's a great point, Michael. And, of course, measuring, how to measure the status quo versus impact, I think is a, I think we need to think through how we're doing that. But I think it's a great point to actually bring it out. I think that's sort of, we assume that that's what we're doing, but to actually establish that as a specific criteria and build it into the evaluation is probably a really useful thing to do. So we'll definitely think about that. I don't know if my colleagues have thoughts.
I think what jumps out to me in terms of the framework for, again, this one chunk that we're talking about is developing actions to adoption readiness for local use and potential application in the program. The piece of the framework that my mind went to, Michael, was that effective piece. The language is evidence suggests the action makes a measurable impact on the intended outcome. So it's not quite verbatim, effects change from status quo, but I think it's the closest and a very similar concept. But I'm wondering what you think of that, or if you think there's something that's missed with that piece that's in there.
Well, that's a great point too.
Any other questions about the content? And just a reminder, the criteria that we were just discussing and that Thea went over are on page 2 of the memo linked in the agenda for this item, and also the definition is on page 1, about halfway down. All right, so we originally, well, a couple of things. One is would like to just have a general conversation about these items, the adoption ready action framework. Is it aligned, or how well is it aligned to the statute, the policy objectives, the racial equity framework? How could that be improved if you see some areas of improvement? And then we had on here that we were going to have an exercise. We've pivoted the agenda just a little bit, but we will definitely discuss those items that are in that exercise section to sort of talk about how some of the example actions, adoption ready actions, could fit into the ARA framework, the adoption ready action framework, and discuss the degree of that sort of universal applicability and how that universality helps or hinders some of the racial equity goals. So we'll talk specifically about that if it doesn't come up naturally in the conversation anyway. But with that, we're really looking for, as I mentioned, and is on the agenda, refinements to the framework or definition that you think need to be made. We'd love to hear your perspectives on those. And then talking about just how this works in reality and how this could, sort of be in place for cities and counties that do HPS planning. So let's get going. You know the drill. Brock definitely knows the drill. He has his hand up. I'm very interested in hearing from everyone in the discussion, and as much as whatever your sort of perspective you're coming into this with, we welcome that. And so I'll kick it off with Brock. Thank you.
So just to clarify, by the framework, we mean the 8 criteria and 3 target areas?
That is,
levels, yeah.
yes.
Like taking that approach to how we pursue the development of adoption-ready actions and that definition.
Okay, I think the criteria, the definitions, I think fine. The criteria I think are good. I think the difficulty is going to be assigning that level 1, 2, or 3. I think there's going to be some wide-ranging views about how some of them might be categorized. But I'll leave it at that for now.
Fair enough. And we can get into the details on that here in a little bit as well. Alan, please go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm finding questions emerging from when I put on my former local planning hat, right? Often we start a project and the first step is in line with our land use goals, right? Public citizen involvement. That's not explicit in this framework. There's partnership cultivation, there's development, like level 1 is doing work with the community, but it seems to be targeted. And I'm not being critical here, but I'm just curious of whether or not we're bypassing what would be a typical public planning process by going straight to stakeholders, not the public. When I see the word partner, that makes me think that they're, or developers or other folks who are not the general public we're working with. And that might be part of an adoption-ready kind of action, but I'm just unclear on whether that was intentional or not, or we want to build in something that's more of a citizen participation piece, because it would slow down the process if I'm putting on that planner's hat. And I think this is meant to be moving toward adoption-ready actions in a fairly streamlined fashion. So just a question, not really saying we need to go that direction or not, but it stood out to me.
I think it's a great point, Alan, that, is something I think maybe we all can keep in mind as we pursue adoption-ready actions, is I think, especially that level 3 of this is ready to go, plug and play, directly applicable. I think we're making an implicit decision there, or statement there, that those actions aren't going to include community participation because they're pre-approved to be used and can be directly applied, and depending on how we craft the compliance pathways, may be encouraged and on the table required to be directly applied. So I think that realm certainly limits some of the community involvement in those actions. But I think that earlier, or maybe not earlier, but the actions that we know require more localized development, that we don't put in that level 3 category, that level 1, just to, we didn't name kind of all of the guidance that may come with those, but I think you're bringing up a good point that some of those that need more localized development, some of the guidance should be to lean more into that community engagement work for sure. And I think the community engagement work of the HPS and the contextualized housing need will remain. However, the more prescriptive a compliance pathway we create, and the more narrow, I think it's I'm taking a moment to speak to it because I think it's a very interesting and important thing for us to keep in mind. So I appreciate you raising it.
Yeah, it's another one of those points of the balance in the balance between flexibility and certainty that we've been trying to find. Thea.
I just wanted to, real quick, because I totally agree with Celestina. I just want to reiterate one of her points that she made, which is that there will be significant engagement still in the program through the HPS process. That establishes the need, and that these, if used, these adoption-ready actions are just intended to be responsive to that need that was identified through an engagement process. So while the development of the action itself may or may not have a level of engagement, there is still engagement deeply built into the process that it's a part of. And we'll talk a lot more about the compliance pathways in the second half. But yes, just in terms of just like the raw adoption ready actions, there is engagement built into the process that they're responding to.
It's helpful to zoom out a little bit. And I think what triggers the question is, like in the schematic figure 1 at the bottom of the memo, partner to leverage efforts and resources, right? For me, that's less citizen and more strategic partnership. Again, just trying to kind of call this out. There may be some discretion we want to give to local municipalities in doing that work, or it might be built into the wider HPS. Thank you.
Thanks, Alan. Thanks for bringing up the question and making us think a little bit harder about that and how that might work. Julia.
Yeah, Alan's comments, I want to respond to that. I will make my initial point real quick, but my wheels are turning based on Alan's point, so it was great. I just wanted to appreciate the kind of further refinement of the definition as a whole. I know I at least was struggling a little bit with the last meeting of this kind of singular definition without kind of a gradient, which I'm seeing a little bit more of in terms of the levels, while simultaneously getting a little bit more specific by way of the criteria. So I really appreciate that, because I know we're all kind of wanting to jump to the compliance framework, but there's just so much, kind of back and forth here, where when I was reviewing the frameworks, kind of thinking through how different levels of ARAs could slot into or play different roles in different frameworks was super helpful for me. So I really appreciate you guys kind of doing some further work on that front. So kind of related to that, and Alan's comment real quick, I thank you, Alan, for bringing up that point. I'm kind of embarrassed I hadn't even thought of that as someone who's like so community engagement focused in a lot of my efforts too. And so I'm kind of just thinking through again how with some of the compliance frameworks, how there's potentially and hopefully ways that we can continue to build in opportunities for community engagement, even with level 3 adoption ready actions. So things like having opportunities for cities to engage with the community, be like, hey, here's a list of options that we can choose from, which one feels like digestible to you, and kind of have it be a collaborative effort in that way, but maybe less opportunities for engagement in terms of the actual policy itself, because of the potential for that to be like a safe harbor or something like that. But I think that's a really good point, and I'm chewing on that a lot. So thanks, Ellen, for bringing that up as well.
Thank you. I'm also thinking about it in the context, and maybe you all too, in that sort of benefits and burdens and the questions being posed in the racial equity framework. And I think that balance, again, might go both ways. With more engagement, sometimes that can be a burden, but obviously a benefit to have a much richer group of people or community members that are engaging in this and helping shape things. Michael, thank you for being patient.
I'll be quick. Alan, this relates to the status quo thing. Alan, you were deeper than I was on middle housing in like 2016, right? And I would say a lesson from that for me was it was very, very difficult to have a conversation about the injustices in our existing zoning at that point. And it was only because of the very firm decision to take the unacceptable status quo off the table that cities were able to have a local conversation about low density zoning. in middle housing. And so I feel like the result was that every city did have a chance to choose among the options provided by the state for middle housing, but only because the state made a decisive decision to say the status quo is not on the table. We just need to find our way to a better one, and there are many options for that. That was my experience of watching it happen in Portland. Maybe it was yours too, Alan. I don't know.
Yeah, to a certain extent, it was a very contentious process. I remember feeling there was a lot of ensconced positions that were impossible to get beyond, and still relationships that are tense because of that, almost 10 years later. So they're good.
Brock, I'm going to pop over to Cassidy and then I'll come back to you. Thank you. Go ahead, Cassidy.
Hi, I think my comments may reveal somewhat of my newness to this topic. I think what I'm hearing and understanding, the concern that I do have as we start to refine, break, and nuance this idea of ARAs is that it diminishes their potential effectiveness. So I think I understand that the concept of breaking into the categories is to sort of be able to tune it and make them more effective potentially. But I am concerned that as they get diluted and more, we have ARAs that like, well, here's your ARA, but then you got to do this, that, and the other, that suddenly we have solutions that are no longer the intent, I think, of making quick, actionable things that can be implemented. So I don't know how do we solve that, but that's like where my brain is.
I think Cassidy makes a really good point with that. This is about getting housing built and doing it fast. There are ample opportunities for public involvement throughout the entire process, but I don't think we need to be adding any extra public input into this portion in particular.
Any other thoughts generally? Thank you, Brock. Thank you, Cassidy. Any other thoughts generally about the levels of, and thank you also, Julie, for sort of recognizing that we heard you in the last meeting, not just you, but the group sort of struggling with how narrowly ARAs were defined. So found a way to kind of think about them a little more broadly with sort of different levels, and maybe one of those levels does have a little more engagement required, but not a full engagement process, or I don't know. We're clearly sorting that out and chewing on what we've just heard this morning. So how is that resonating? And then the criteria as well. I've heard a couple of comments on those and the definition. I just want to make sure we get your opinions on those. Alan, hi.
Oops, sorry about that. Hi. I think this is going to be fair ground. I missed the last meeting, but this is really a question about the policy objectives, and I think it's fair game because the policy objectives are part of how the criteria work and how the framework work. And this is specifically, and I don't know that we need to answer it here. I just wanted to bring it up though and have a conversation about it eventually. And it did come up at I just watched the recording of the January meeting. It did come up there, and it's a question about the high opportunity areas and the way that they are included in the policy objectives. And specifically, the number 2 policy objectives talks about the desire to increase production in high opportunity areas to increase housing choice. Well, I don't disagree with that. But my question is that I'm wondering if we also need to address the flip side of that, particularly because it mentions the anti-displacement piece. Very often, communities that haven't had access to opportunity live in communities that aren't currently high opportunity areas. And so if we were only to emphasize production in high opportunity areas, it would mean that folks who weren't in high opportunity areas now would be displaced to high opportunity areas. And so, again, as a high level policy objective, I think we can include that. I think we don't want to ignore the flip side of that, which is the investment in areas that aren't high opportunity areas. And also when we talk about community engagement, we also often hear from communities that that's what their desire is. And we often hear, please actually do invest in more affordable housing in my neighborhood so that I can stay in my neighborhood. even though it may not be a high opportunity area now, can we create a high opportunity area again without tipping it to an area now that is one that would cause displacement, right? So how do we actually solve that final piece of it? So wanted to put that on the table as just really having stuck out to me from the policy objectives upon which the other parts of the framework are built.
Anyone from the team want to reflect on that? I know that's been some part of the conversation already, but.
Absolutely, Alan, and Vice Chair Lazo, thank you so much for bringing it up. I think that in terms of, the intent of the entirety of the program, the answer is yes, because the directive of housing choice pushes us to say that, without asking every individual in a neighborhood one by one, going each household for what kind of housing they need and where, the paradigm of housing choice would direct us to say that there should be options available for folks in a variety of areas, and that their options not be limited to one part of town or another. And I think that policy objective came from a pattern of not having choice in high opportunity areas, and noting that that is a place where choice really needs to be emphasized, especially for low-income communities, communities of color, people with disabilities, folks who have been commonly excluded from those areas. But that, I think, to your point, there's a nuance there that we need not lose sight of, which is that it's not to the then alternate exclusion of choice to stay put in a neighborhood where there is community and there's relationships and there are richness and amenities in that way that can't just be created overnight in the high opportunity areas. So I certainly think that as a group here, we can keep both in mind in terms of those objectives. I think that's where that piece came from. Do you have any follow-ups you want to add? Because I think it's an important piece.
Yeah, I'm just curious if there's a way for us to potentially refocus that objective around both sides of that of choices that you just mentioned, rather than focusing it on the production of high opportunities, to say that we recognize that's important, but also the displacement piece is important. So and that's my concern, is just the strong focus on high opportunity areas. And I certainly understand the current status of areas that are exclusionary, and particularly high opportunity areas that are exclusionary. But I'm not sure it's the sole focus of how we measure objectives.
Great, thank you. Some additional levels of thought and conversation there. Go ahead, Garland.
Yeah, so this brings to mind something that we struggled with in Portland when we were debating the residential infill project, and it's this tension between smart growth and equity. The smart growth paradigm tells us that we should focus our density around high quality transit stations and other high opportunity areas. But equity says, wait, but that's locking out property owners and residents of areas that aren't high opportunity of the opportunity to gain wealth, generational wealth through, say, missing middle development, or other ways to intensify their own areas. And then, Alan, you hit the nail on the head. Like, why are we locking high opportunity areas into just a set geography? Shouldn't we also be trying to expand access to opportunity and, building new transit lines or retrofitting single-use suburban neighborhoods into multi-use neighborhoods that have increased access to amenities and increased opportunity? And so I think that, in Portland, equity won out. We decided to allow access to metal housing types in the zoning code citywide, and not just concentrate access to those types, or to being able to develop those types in former single family zones in high opportunity areas. And I think that's the right choice for equitable reasons, but I think that there's more work to be done to unpack what that really means, especially with regards to areas that aren't currently high opportunity because they don't have good access to amenities, they may not have good transit service. What's our plan to fix those areas? I think that that's a really important question to ask as we go down this path. If we go down this path as a state of saying, no, we're going to go on the side of equity and trying to increase access to opportunity in more areas and not just try to concentrate opportunity and access to opportunity in a set geography of winners, therefore saying the rest of the geographies are geographies of losers, the areas that don't have access to opportunity.
Thank you, Garland, for further exploring that sort of two sides or two ways we need to be addressing access to opportunity. Appreciate that and appreciate this conversation. Before we leave this item, I want to check in on a couple of things that were in the agenda. One is specific to the sort of accountability side of the program. So there's action selection and setting out to do something, and then there's performance. And sort of wondering, as you all are looking at this or thinking about this, and I'll maybe lean a little heavily on the folks that were part of the housing acceleration conversations last year as well. To what degree can adoption ready actions be developed for universal applicability and in a way that helps that accountability conversation, or what are some of the pitfalls of that? And really looking at the last discussion question for this agenda item, thinking about the racial equity framework. We've been talking a little bit about the benefits and burdens today, but want to dig just a little bit deeper on accountability and benefits of burdens, and this desire to have adoption-ready actions that are applicable for most. We'll call it most. All would be a great thing, but most places. Are there some troubled waters you would recommend we avoid? Do you feel like it's possible to get to adoption-ready actions that will get that balance of benefits and burdens right? Other considerations in that realm? Yeah, Shannon.
Yeah, thank you so much, Deb. I think where I'm feeling optimistic and hopeful is around some actions I'm not sure I saw on the list. So there's a little concern there too. For example, land banking. Maybe I just skipped right over it, but that's, to me, it just checks a whole lot of boxes. It doesn't have to be complicated. A municipality would just need to choose to do it.
You're saying adoption-ready action could be land banking.
Yeah, and another one that I think we discussed, and again, I'll admit it's been a little bit of a crazy time, so I'm feeling less prepared. I didn't study each one so carefully as I would have preferred. But also like deferring SDCs, even for single family development by for-profit builders. I mean, I want to be careful that we're not making some things overly complicated.
Fair enough. Thank you. And I thank you for bringing this up as well. The potential adoption-ready actions that are in the memo are examples. They're not comprehensive. Yeah. The universal list of actions has land banking, has some of these other things. But yeah, the exercise would be to look at all of the actions and some of the assessment of effectiveness there, and then think about whether or not they could be adoption-ready actions. And I think we'll be giving you some follow-up opportunities to do that after this meeting as well. Anything else on this before we move along?
Very quick, I think to the community engagement piece, I think the more predictable and well-defined those adoption ready actions are, even if there's some flexibility in like what you actually what a city chooses to pursue, the more buy-in there will be, and the more ability for the city to choose its own path there will be. So, like, to me, a key part of getting a high-functioning accountability system is to have those pieces be very well defined in advance, so everybody understands what they're aiming towards and what the options are and what the possibilities are, once they reach that off-ramp in the accountability program.
Thank you. Details matter and will be a real critical piece in understanding what the potential is for that adoption-ready action, as well as for cities to understand that it's something they want to take on. Great. All right. I'm going to move us along then. Not fully, because we'll still be talking about adoption-ready actions, but talking about it in the context of compliance. So compliance pathways for again, this is for housing production strategy and housing acceleration program parts of the housing planning program for the state and cities therein. And I apologize, but I don't recall who at DLCD is taking this. Celestina. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Deb. And I will be reviewing pieces of the compliance pathway memo that we had in our materials. So you'll see identical and similar language. And hang in there with us as we try and explore some of these nitty-gritty program design pieces. Mari, if you're able to pull, oh, there it is. Okay, I almost filled enough time. Okay, great. So this is a recap. This is the maybe at least second, maybe third time we've looked at a table like this here in the HOG meetings, but nonetheless want to continue to orient to the different tools that we can use to build compliance and this more formalized compliance pathway through the housing production strategy and acceleration programs. So these are some of the options that we need to be considering and sorting through and hearing your feedback on. One being safe harbor. Brock, I see you put your hand up, and I'm thinking it might be urgent, given I'm still presenting.
Oh, my question on this was just where did the guidance category go? Because this has changed since the last time we saw it, and the guidance is no longer included.
Yeah, definitely. So guidance can't actually offer compliance in any way. It's not regulatory. It doesn't have any power to say, yes, yes, you have completed the program requirements. Only rules can do that. So we presented it to help frame our understanding of program design generally, but in terms of the options that we have to actually provide a compliance pathway, it wouldn't be able to serve that purpose. And you'll actually see a couple notes in the memo as well that start to speak to that. For example, the housing production strategy menu of actions that we currently have serves as guidance. And in order to incorporate something like that into a more formal compliance pathway, it would have to actually be adopted either duplicatively or a version of it into rule. So that's another piece to keep in mind about that distinction. So thanks for mentioning it. Happy to speak to it. Okay, so safe harbor being optional and predictable, right? You can do it, you don't have to do it, but if you do it, you can be assured that this piece of the program, whichever the safe harbor is applied to, will be compliant. Rebuttable presumption means that we're going to assume that a local government would pursue this part of the program in this way, unless there's a demonstration to the alternative. So it sort of does a little bit of a flip, but still leaves the room for demonstrating an alternative pathway that is commensurate in impact and efficacy. Minimum standard does not leave any room for deviation in terms of at least getting this basic minimum standard done or achieved for any given part of the program, but does allow room to do something in addition. So this is the minimum standard, but you may exceed a minimum standard. And then lastly is regulatory requirement, and that would be applied for anything where the prescription is at a level of specificity and precision such that going above or beyond in any way actually is not the goal and would not be effective. And it's just exactly performing in exactly this way is the limitation for using the regulatory requirement tool. So hopefully those are starting to feel familiar. We can go to the next slide. These might not feel as familiar just yet, but hopefully we'll start to acquaint. This is our first go at conceptualizing and discussing the various ways to build a compliance pathway, specifically through the housing production strategy and acceleration programs, where so much of our emphasis is on the actions that local governments are taking. So how do we interact with actions, selecting actions in the HPS, and then also how do actions come into play in the acceleration agreement through the audit and that process. And so trying to understand the elements that go into selecting actions, particularly in the HPS for the moment is what I'll focus on. We've proposed two different elements of that selection process, one being relevance and another being sufficiency. So the relevance might seem intuitive for a lot of us, but there's a logical question in play in terms of identifying a housing need and selecting an action that we believe is relevant that will have impact specifically to that housing need. So there is a filtering there. And so in the memo and here we had a few different ways that relevance may be able to be established in a more formal way through a more formal compliance pathway. That could be tagging, right? Having a large list of actions like we have in the HPS menu, and any given action can be tagged by many different needs that it may meet or circumstances that it may suit. Another approach is to have standalone lists that are oriented to the need itself. So you might say, I have this issue, I have this housing need locally. Here are the options that I can select from in terms of how to meet it. It's the same data points, but organized a little bit differently. And the way that the compliance pathway may structure could vary a little bit. Or criteria-based. So this would require a little bit more development likely, but if there is some level of evaluation that a local government would do in ensuring that the action that they are selecting is relevant by checking a few boxes and demonstrating that it meets a few criteria for relevance. So we want to hone in on what paths to take there, or start to hone in on how to develop the program in terms of determining relevance. And then we also have the question of sufficiency. And this is can be understood as sufficiency of one action or even a group of actions, because really we're oriented to meeting the housing need. So meeting the housing need could require multiple actions. So you'll see that sufficiency of an action or actions kind of highlights a little bit of a distinction there. And we have presented a few different options in terms of how we might understand sufficiency. How many actions or what kinds of actions pack enough of a punch that we feel that they are a strong pass at attempting to meet the housing needs locally. So again, we have a few different styles. We have a list of actions and then a count and potentially even as few as one. So again, we've got that starts to kind of combine some of the relevance tools with the sufficiency tools. So we would assume that we have a list of actions that are relevant, and a local government can select one. We have specific actions that are pre-identified as being responsive to specific needs, and it might just be limited to even one. If you have this need, we've got this specific action, and that's the safe harbor, or that's the minimum requirement, or whichever one we want to apply, so that I'm starting to preview applying the compliance tools, layering over some of these program design tools, but just limiting to a predefined specific action. And then we have a larger kind of concept of having a menu style selection process that isn't as simple as we have a list of actions and you just pick one, like that first one, but it's a little bit more nuanced in that there is some further sorting that needs to happen for impact. And that could be an impact rating system, something like a high, medium, low understanding, where, for example, a local government might need to select one high and one medium action to meet any given need that they have. Or in the point-based realm, they might need to have 4 points worth of actions that respond to each of their key housing needs, for example. And that could potentially be done, by 1 high impact action or 2 medium. But I'm talking conceptually there because in the point-based framework, they would be given points instead of high, medium, low. So 2 2-point actions, maybe there's 1 4-point action. And there's space and flexibility for the local government to have some refining of what route they really take. And this is similar to what Julia was mentioning earlier on the call. I'll just kind of pull some of these conversations together where there is some room to make a selection where there is input that could be fielded. So hopefully that helps ground us a little bit in the way that we're starting to think about these program design options. So I do have one more slide, but I'd like to pause here and just ask for, take a check for understanding and clarifying questions on how we've framed this part out. Okay, thank you. So let's go to the next slide, which I wish were less wordy, but it is what it is for today. And thank you all for your patience with that. But I'll put voice to all of it. Hopefully make it a little bit more digestible. So we just wanted to put forward an example about how to bring kind of all of that we've talked about together for a moment for one specific example, so we can start to explore what options we may think will work best to achieve our policy objectives. So the example that I have here today is we're looking at the specific need of more multi-unit housing. So we're just isolating that for a moment, isolating it from any other understanding of affordability. But for the purposes of example, we're just simply saying we need more multi-unit housing in the local government. And an adoption-ready action that we know will be developed because we're mandated to develop model code for different housing types. So we can rely on this one being in play here is a model code oriented to multi-unit housing. So that's available and could potentially be used in developing a compliance pathway on meeting the multi-unit housing need in the HPS process and selecting actions. So then if we go back in our minds to the last slide, Mari, you can stay where we are on this slide, but to the ideas about how we understand relevance and how we understand sufficiency, I've selected 2 of those as an example. So if we were to say we like the tag option, we have this big menu, or I shouldn't use that, too many menus. We have this big list of options, and they're all tagged as meeting different needs. And so as long as local government is selecting an action that is tagged to meet multi-unit housing need, then they've got relevancy. And then for sufficiency, we're considering how the menu with a point-based system might apply. So those actions might also have points assigned to them. So if we were to say, let's try applying a safe harbor tool to meeting housing type need in the HPS with a point-based menu system. That means that the local government would be in a position where they may choose to use model code sections that are pre-tagged to support multi-unit housing and, for example, that offer 4 points toward meeting multi-unit housing type need. Option. They may choose that. Another option would be a rebuttable presumption tool applied to this example. So local government should select actions that are pre-tagged to support multi-unit housing need and total 4 points toward meeting that housing need, unless they demonstrate an alternative approach with commensurate impact. Minimum standard, local government must select model code sections that are pre-tagged to support multi-unit housing, but may and total 4 points, but may select additional actions if they would like. And then the regulatory requirement is, again, that most prescribed, that local government must select the model code sections that are pre-tagged to support multi-unit housing and that satisfy exactly the point target with no deviation. So hopefully that helps start to boil this down into these specific applications so that we can work through a little bit more which of these tools we feel apply to parts of the program, the safe harbor, rebuttable presumption, minimum requirement, and what program design option we feel like serves the policy objectives and the program goals as well. So the last slide I have is just another recap slide on those policy objectives. So diversity of housing options is what we're aiming for. So diversity of housing types, characteristics, and locations. We want to ensure that the compliance pathway produces and retrofits homes in high opportunity areas that increase housing choice in those areas where it doesn't currently exist related to equity driven needs. And we know that we're also keeping in mind ensuring that choice is still available in lower opportunity areas, streamlining the housing development process, and increasing community capacity and resilience in support of equitable housing production at the local level. So really reducing capacity constraints and making resilient long-term decisions at the local level. With that, I'll hand it back over to Deb. Thank you all for hanging in there with me. We are not getting in the weeds. We are in the weeds.
We are deep in the weeds, and maybe not just weeds, lots of plant life. Thank you for the great example, Celestina, and the reminder of the policy objectives. I think those are super helpful. Before I open it up for the discussion questions, I want to acknowledge that some folks in the room here work in this compliance realm every day because they're either doing planning that's going through land use compliance or on the advocacy side. Others in the room are more focused on the implementation side, getting things built, producing housing. And I just want to make space for all of you to provide us feedback. Some of you will have very specific feedback about these specific details deep in the weeds. But I really want to welcome, even if you feel like you're a little lost on some of the bureaucratic or administrative details, it's really important to hear from those of you trying to produce housing, to let us know if there's sort of some of these compliance pathways, if you will, that resonate a little bit better. Like, gosh, it would be great if cities had a minimum standard and they just moved on with their planning so I knew what I needed to build or had an opportunity to build in a greater way. Or, wow, what I'm seeing on my end is cities need lots of flexibility. We need to offer all sorts of options. Minimum standards aren't likely to apply, or some variation in between. I'm framing these up in not the most helpful way, but really just trying to invite the broader voices of that are in the room here and make sure you have an entry point, and we're happy to help you find your way through that as well in this conversation. So with that, our first question, let me just sort of tee up the first question in the agenda, and then I'll get to you, Brock. So thinking about housing production strategy specifically, that's for those of you a little bit newer here, that's the process cities and communities are going through to think about what actions they're going to take to produce housing, more housing, also affordability and choice. So for the work of the housing production strategy, which of the compliance pathways that Celestina just sort of recapped could best balance the responsiveness to local contextualized housing need with the predictability and decreased analytical burden of the statewide compliance pathway? So that's analytical burden on cities and the communities they work for. All right, Brock, please go ahead.
Yeah, less direct to this question, but I would really like to hear how the cities feel about this before we even dive into this a little bit further. I don't think we've gotten a lot of response from them, but from the standpoint that they are going to be the implementers on the ground, I'd like to hear their thoughts about this process as it's currently laid out.
Yeah, great.
Hearing their perspective.
Thank you for inviting that. And yeah, and just their experiences complying with the program. I just want to point out before we get there, I'll get to you first, Rachel. We are missing a couple of our local government partners. They had to hop off to other meetings, or Alex, who's with League of Cities, is with the legislature today. But let's get the perspectives we have in the room today, and also I think too, I would invite our consultant team members who work with cities a lot in compliance. They might also be able to shed some light on this. So, but before we get there, Rachel, please.
Thanks. Going back deep in the weeds. Just more like of a legal definition question. The safe harbor versus the rebuttal presumption. One of them says you may do, you may choose, and the other one is you should choose. From a legal challenge standpoint, like what is really the difference between may and should, and how does that stand up, if there's some sort of challenge?
Thanks, Rachel. These are words, I mean, may show up, may show up in the safe harbor language, but this is not exact rule language.
Okay.
So for the safe harbor, it would be that a local government may, and if they do, that portion of that rule requirement will be met. And the rebuttable presumption would be, the rules would probably be written in a way to say that this is what a local government must do unless they've demonstrated otherwise. So that's getting a little deeper into that rule language. It's a fair question. So the slide was more how we're conceptualizing the process.
Got it. Thank you.
Thank you. Anne, hi.
Hi. So I am with the City of Albany local government, and I have before seeing the last slide and reading the materials, I was like, oh yeah, one of the rebuttable presumption or minimum standards would probably be best for cities to allow adaptability to our local situations and needs, right? But when I saw that last slide and the mays and the musts, I have a lot of concerns because the safe harbors, we don't all have those right in front of us to know what those are, but I do remember watching a meeting and the safe harbors were just off in the way they were worded. So if I was to bypass safe harbor where it's the only option for may choose model code language. We don't know what the model code language is going to be yet. I mean, of course, maybe we would by then I'm forced into a sort of a must situation to use the model code language, and not knowing what the model code language is, that's a little concerning. I mean, rebuttable would probably be the best if we should, if we're trying to get to performance measures and outcomes and a point system, and we all want to move the needle on housing, right? But every community has different needs. We don't necessarily all need multi-dwelling unit development. We may need accessible housing or whatever it is, or smaller footprint housing or something. So right now, it looks like the rebuttable presumption seems to offer the most flexibility, and with the word should, but at first I thought maybe the minimum standards approach was going to provide that until I saw the slide. I don't know. The safe harbors are not necessarily crafted for a variety of city sizes, and they're making some assumptions about the types of housing that are needed in the marketplace, when each community has different needs based on their housing needs analysis. So those are my thoughts initially, but I would love to hear what others have to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anne. Any questions for Anne before I move on? Okay.
I might just make sure that y'all know that we have not, last year we explored the concept of safe harbors and the content of potential safe harbors in the Needs and Production Technical Advisory Committee, to be sure. But in terms of the HOG work this year and the materials that we've put out over the last couple of months, we've not proposed any safe harbor language or anything in that vein yet. So anything that is in those materials is really at the example level for the purpose of thinking about things. So just want to make sure you know that, Anne. And I think, sorry, I'm a little slow on the clarifying question, but I do have one, which is, if the safe harbors are oriented to needs from the contextualized housing need that have been identified, if it's oriented to, okay, City of Albany already knows that this is the need, and we're just saying this is how you can be sure to meet that need. Does that change your feedback on safe harbor?
Yeah, it would. It would. So, without knowing what the safe harbors are going to be, but yeah, if there was one for each housing type or income range or whatever, that would be better. And then we could, I would think differently about the matrix and the options if that was the case. Absolutely.
And with that, I'm hearing the difference being that there is a direct connection between whatever's in your contextualized housing need and a safe harbor, not just a safe harbor that may or may not apply. Got it. Brock, I'm going to skip over you again, sorry, and take Mac and a couple of others that we haven't heard from yet. So go ahead, Mac.
Thank you. Actually, I'm wondering if Brianne and Ariel could go before me, since they are from city, be interfacing more, and then if I could go after them, that'd be great. Thank you.
And I saw Josh's hand up too. Josh, did I skip over you by accident?
Hold my hand down, kind of with the same thing Mac was saying. I wanted to hear from the cities first. I mean, I represent a number of cities and I can speak for them, but we have people from cities that can speak for them better than I can.
Great. Well, let's do that. We'll take Brianne and then Ariel. Go ahead, Brianne. Thanks.
Thanks. Yep. Sorry, I kind of had to jump out. I had a technician at my house, so in and out of the conversation a little bit. But jumping back in, I guess just my kind of initial look at this is I would have some concerns with the minimum standards or regulatory requirement. The rebuttable presumption could work, I guess the way it's worded, but I'm just thinking practically speaking, looking at it, it still puts a lot of burden on the city then to demonstrate that it provides additional burden. So it's like, it's another requirement. And then if you're not going to do this, then you have to demonstrate why you're not doing it. And I'm thinking, like, practically speaking, if it's model code or something, well, what if we've already adopted a code that's similar, but it's not the model code and it doesn't work. And model codes, I mean, I know I've said this before, but like, they're not as plug and play, I think, as often folks think they are. So they're not always the most helpful. It's not like just adopt it and it's good. Like, there are tendrils throughout the entire development code often that has a lot of cascading effects. So in looking at it, like, even the rebuttable presumption, I have a little bit of concern with. It's just taking away, I guess, the flexibility for a city to come up with a solution on their own. But that said, I think are cities that it could work better for. I'm just thinking of us, like me specifically, or City of Bend specifically, having to implement some of these things I just don't know how helpful it is. I mean, if the intent is for the adoption ready actions to be helpful, that it actually seems like it's becoming more burdensome in that regard. It doesn't seem like it's like shelf ready and helpful. Just my initial thoughts, but again, I'm kind of coming in at halfway, so.
So maybe that balance that one could find in rebuttable presumption maybe isn't quite there for you anyway. And again, like not specific to model code was used as an example. It could be all sorts of other parts of the program that could be, well, there are other parts of the program that are in this compliance and types of actions that could be selected, but I'm hearing maybe the one that has the most flexibility is rebuttable presumption to meet local need, but also has some potentially some additional burden on cities.
Yeah, or really just the safe harbor. It seems like it's probably has the greatest flexibility, but because it's a may, it's not a must.
Right, fully optional. Celestina.
Yeah, thanks, Deb. I just want to emphasize Deb's last point, which is that we can both think about how the adoption ready actions could be applied to safe harbor or rebuttable presumption. And we can also think about if it wasn't an adoption ready action and it was actions more broadly. So we're not, fully assuming at this point that adoption ready actions only would be what constitutes a safe harbor. But nonetheless, Brianne, your point about maybe even a model code wouldn't function great even as a safe harbor is still helpful.
Thank you. And then Ariel. Oh, we can't hear you, Ariel. I don't know. It's not showing you're muted. No, you might have to maybe try one more time. Connecting audio. That looks hopeful. All right, how about now?
Yeah, can you hear me? Yeah, that's great. That's a lot of thumbs up. Thanks. So maybe similarly to Brianne, this is like a lot of information to digest and also to give like a quick and dirty, this is exactly what I think this should be. But just initial sort of feelings are that there's a matrix of options that are being presented as potential pathways. So like the tagging and the standalone list or the menu list, and then also, the safe harbor rebuttal. And my initial feelings are there's a combination within that matrix that would not work well I'm just thinking if we had this compliance pathway for the last HPS, for example, that must combined with the existing menu of actions that we must have picked from. When we took our actions, we included the DLCD menu and we took that to our technical advisory committee and we took it to the public. And to be frank, those weren't, many of those weren't the actions that were selected to meet our needs. So to be in a situation where we must pick from that list and we must apply those actions would be a little bit tough. Not to say that having the options, so a may, could work with the standalone list or the menu list. And I'm sure there's some other combination within that matrix that would work well for our jurisdiction in terms of compliance. But that must plus the list option would probably, my first instinct is that's probably not an easy option for jurisdictions.
Thank you. And thank you to all the cities for being put on the spot and giving us some initial thoughts. It's very helpful. And as you can hear, many people are interested in hearing sort of your local experiences. So much appreciated. All right, with that, I'm going to just start with Brock then and move through hands raised. So please go ahead, Brock.
Thank you. And so thank you to Brianne and Ariel. That is exactly why I wanted to have them talk about this before the rest of us did. What we just heard from all three of them is that minimum compliance standard, regulatory requirement are pretty much off the table. The rebuttable presumption is incredibly difficult, and there's still some issues with the safe harbor too. If we go with the rebuttable presumption, that means we pick one thing that every city has to do to meet a certain housing need, right? How do we select which one that's going to be? And even if we go with the safe harbor and say, okay, you can do this and it's a safe harbor, which one's going to be the safe harbor? How are we determining that as a group? And we can say, okay, safe harbor is going to be one of the high impact ones. Well, there's like 5 high impact scenarios, tools in the 25-page list that we got. That does not leave a lot of room. Cities are saying that they need flexibility. They need this guidance, right? So that they can look at it. But even as we heard from Portland, you can look at this list and still have a majority of your actions not come from it. And if you're having to rebut the fact that your strategy is going to work for every single thing that you do, we're never going to get through this process. So my point in all of this is that there is a lot of detail to work through to determine what possible safe harbors could be, even just pulling from that list. And even looking back at that list, right, in comparison to the kind of flow chart on the back that Eco Northwest provided, right, there are some serious inconsistencies between this and the list. For example, the tenant option to purchase, right, in the 25-page doc says it is a medium to high impact tool. That does not create a single new housing unit, not one. I'm not arguing against it altogether. I'm just saying it does not produce any more housing units than already exist. At the same time, a UGB expansion was listed as low to medium, depending on need. That's at the high end of the list that Eco Northwest provided on their sliding scale. But at the same time, using public land within the UGBs is a high impact scenario on the list. So somehow adding land through a UGB expansion is low impact, maybe medium impact, but using public land that's already inside is high impact. That does not make sense. So what I'm saying is, as we're going through this, as we're trying to figure out if we're going to do safe harbors or rebuttable presumptions or anything like that, there is some serious refinement and some serious considerations that need to go into that. Part of that being that this list has real problems as it currently exists. And those need to be reconciled, because otherwise we're going to be setting up cities for failure. And I apologize. I know I was rambling a little bit there, but that's
it's fine. Thank you. I'm sure we're going to have some additional opinions about whether some of these are off the table or are the right things for different types. So I just want to make sure everyone knows those thoughts are also welcome and open. Before I go to the next one, though, Celestina, I think you have a comment to make.
Thanks, Deb. Yeah, I just wanted to mark us in time in this process and where these deliverables are. So you are absolutely right, Brock. No question, full stop, that if we were to pursue a high, medium, low ranked compliance pathway, that we would need to get to a much more thorough assessment of what the high, medium, and low rankings would be. What we've presented here is a point in time as we are continuing to cull all of the actions and trying to start to get a preliminary understanding of how some of this might work. But particularly if it's already work planned, and particularly if we pursue a high, medium, low impact style approach to this work, we'd be establishing criteria as to what high, medium, and what counts as high, medium, and low, and working through that in the coming months. So I just want to affirm that both for you and for the collective that that is definitely a point in time in February, with months to go. Not that that's all that much time, but just know that.
Thank you for that, and for the reminder of sort of where we are in time and space and volume of things to come. Mac, please, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. No, and Celestine, I appreciate you bringing, again, that point in time sort of reference, and that this is a current stage, and this universal menu is very much prepared in the past and has been added. And I appreciate that you all have been going through back meetings and whatnot and adding to it. But of course, yes, there's still some refinement that can be done in the months ahead. As I was thinking through some of the responses before, I still think that a tag-oriented for relevance of an action sort of framework could be really useful. Anne's comments, I felt like, also really further reinforced that for me, because especially if that universal menu, which is already sort of, you all have been going in that direction as well in tagging items. If it was like an Excel workbook that was made available to cities locked, then had a filter feed. So if I am working on a housing production strategy and I want to focus on some things that I know will work for accessibility, I can just filter the feed and see the things that count towards accessibility, knowing that some of those things intersect as well with different policy goals like affordability, choice, and the like. is a way that can be really sort of user-friendly as a product for a jurisdiction to work with. And then in terms of like how to interact with, like, I view this kind of in two different ways. Like the first question is how should the menu be or how should the, universal menu list, whatever, be organized? And then the second step being how should a jurisdiction interact with it? And I think then that like a menu option, whether that is for a safe harbor, a rebuttal opportunity, or a minimum standard, I think could be really useful and effective. And the reason I kind of say that is I have a lot of caution about a single sort of action. Like, for example, with affordability, the thing that we know that's going to work the most is direct subsidy. And so if that's the thing that we put is that's what you need to achieve a safe harbor or a minimum standard, that's not fair to a lot of jurisdictions that are not as resource rich and can't do a several $100 million bond. And so that's where I think a menu option is really important, and that it will allow for some smaller, like for jurisdictions that are more resource constrained, to be able to pick and choose some smaller impact cumulative items that when you stack them really do actually have impact. Because outside of perhaps money, there's really no silver bullet to increasing housing production. If there was, I'm sure we would have found it, we would have implemented it, and we would be closer to meeting our housing production goals there. And so that's sort of some of my thoughts there, but also I bring that up as well, thinking about like, of those adoption ready actions that are within that universal list. Like again, like being stated, we have a limited amount of time, and we're going to really sort of, if we move in that, as we move towards finalizing the direction we want to go in, we're going to really need to focus on a lot of what are those adoption ready actions that can go out the door day one. Over time, we can add to that list and refine it. And I think that is going to be really important. And I hope that this becomes a living document. I think that's also where the rebuttals that a jurisdiction could provide could then later get fed into it. But just really recognizing the need that this is going to need to be ready soon, and focusing on some things initially of high, medium, low impact or point value that is ready to get out the door is going to be really important. Thank you.
Thank you, Mac. Yeah, thinking about maybe discrete actions that are more broadly applicable, but also you just mentioned a word that I think is worth us continuing to think about, which is making sure the framework, or sort of whatever the framework ends up being, is a little durable over time and can flex with issues that are 5 years from now that may be different from the primary issues around the state today. So I know we're thinking about that, but good reminder. I'm going to keep moving along here. Matt, hi.
Hi, good morning. So first of all, I really appreciated what Mac just had to say. I thought that was really well said. I do think that it's, again, point in time wise, way too early to be saying that certain compliance pathways are quote unquote off the table. With regard to minimum standards and regulatory requirements, I certainly could see why cities would feel that they don't offer the same type of possible responsiveness to a contextualized housing need analysis. So I don't actually think it's that surprising to hear that safe harbors or rebuttable presumptions might be easier for some cities in that respect. But I think one thing I'm curious to know about in terms of this discussion and the context of it is, are these compliance pathways mutually exclusive? Is it we pick one compliance pathway and that's it? Because it could be that there are certain housing characteristics that may be better suited to certain types of compliance pathways, whereas other types of housing characteristics might be better suited to rebuttable presumptions or safe harbors. And so I think we should leave all of these things on the table, because all of these compliance pathways may have a value with respect to various characteristics that we're trying to achieve. And yeah, so I just, there was one other point I wanted to make, and I might have to come back to me on that one, but I just think generally speaking, with regard to accessibility, in terms of like, decrease analytical burden and predictability. Minimum standards and regulatory requirements can be more suitable for some things related to accessibility because the analytical burden currently of trying to determine certain accessibility factors is pretty high. And so it might actually suit cities to have more minimum standards or regulatory requirements surrounding some of those characteristics, whereas other things maybe less so.
Thank you, Matt. Yes, it's correct that the burdens of analysis are not equal for all things cities are planning for. And
There was one other, so I remembered
Go
what
ahead.
the other thought was. Sorry to interrupt you, Deb. I'm also curious, when we talk about the point system, they're talking about 4 points here, 4 points there. I'm curious if could additional points be offered for things like a minimum standard or a regulatory requirement? Again, I'm not quite sure how the point system fits in here, but it seems like if a city's going to put their neck out there, quote unquote, so to speak, and actually try to adopt a minimum standard as one of their adoption ready actions or one of their actions, then that could be weighted differently.
Thank you for that. And also for the opportunity just to clarify and pull us back a little bit. The point of presenting these potential compliance pathways today is not to reduce the number of options at this point. It's just to make sure we have the spectrum of options on the table, because then the details will start getting worked out according to this generalized framework. And it's also really important to hear some of the pluses and minuses as you're seeing them about how that might play out that for us to consider. Rachel, go ahead.
If I could just answer Matt's question really quick about can we choose different tools to apply to different needs? And the short answer is we could design this program however we want to. Yes. And Deb, I'll let you decide if you want to go there or not, but it is even one of the discussion questions for our last discussion today. So you're right on it, Matt.
I would like to hold on that to make it our last discussion because we definitely will get there, but I'm glad to hear about that. Thank you. Go ahead, Brianne.
I would just to kind of, oh, can you hear me? Just to
Yes.
follow up on my initial kind of comment is like, it's hard to say because there's so many things on the universal list. So I'm not necessarily opposed to minimum standards or regulatory requirements. Oftentimes those actually provide an easier pathway for a city because we just do it. Like in the climate friendly and equitable communities rules, for example, you could choose get rid of parking or do all of these really complicated things. And for the city, that was actually, it's just easier to just pick the thing and do it and get credit for it and be done. I guess I just have some concerns with the way it's currently written. And I know these are not the final way that it's currently written, but it's saying, a jurisdiction must adopt the action. And I guess I would just want to be careful. There's so many actions and we haven't identified what those actions are yet that I'm not quite sure I could say that that's a good path for a city because for us, for City of Bend or Portland or someone that's already taken a lot of actions, we may have already taken equivalent actions or actions that maybe come up with a better outcome. And I'm hesitant to say I would be okay with a regulatory requirement if I don't know what those actions, they haven't been identified yet. So I do think that there's probably some benefit to the minimum standard or regulatory requirement pathway for certain types of actions, especially for cities that maybe haven't taken very many steps yet. But for cities that have already done a lot, as it's currently written, it's not really giving any credit to the actions that you've already taken. So that's, I guess, where my kind of apprehension is. And I don't know what those actions are yet because we haven't identified, we have the universal list, but I guess I just wanted to clarify, I'm not necessarily against those pathways. It's just too hard to know at this point whether or not I think they would work for us.
Hard to get locked into something when you don't quite understand what you're locking into. I get that. Rachel, I think I accidentally skipped over you and I apologize.
No worries. I lowered my hand, so it got confusing.
Outsmarted me. Sorry.
I just wanted to, from the perspective of a lender, I know some people are new here, so I work for Network for Oregon Affordable Housing, which is a not-for-profit, mission-based affordable housing lender. So I don't represent, any banks or anything, but we do work closely with banks and kind of function as a bank, providing permanent loans for multifamily affordable housing. What we're seeing currently is we really don't have a good understanding of how housing is going to be funded, particularly affordable housing, and how it's going to be built with the current political situation and so much uncertainty around it. And I think this is a really good opportunity to examine what pathways we should be implementing in a situation with a great amount of certainty. And the whole point of this is to increase housing production. And if we are decreasing our flexibility, in the long term, that might be harmful to actual production. And I think I'll just leave it there.
Thank you. I appreciate that, Rachel, and appreciate you mentioning, not just the current uncertainty about federal funding for affordable housing, but those sort of uncertainties that introduce themselves all the time, and thinking about how to build a system that can be responsive or at least acknowledge those. Julia.
Yeah. First, I just want to go zoom way back and just again share a immense amount of appreciation for the kind of thought and presentation that went into this information. The memo was really great, and then the slides took it to a next level of just I feel like I really appreciate that you guys are giving us something to respond to, and in a way that's very digestible despite how complicated it is. So just thank you so much for doing that. This conversation has been great because of that, I think. So with that, a lot of people have already made a lot of points that I was going to make. So I'm not going to dig into it too much, but just want to reiterate my support for kind of a +1 of definitely love the point that was just being made and the term that Mac was using in terms of making sure that this is durable. So let's make sure we're all thinking kind of long term in terms of, right now we might have certain situations, certain funding, but in the future that might be different. Same with just kind of market demands and whatnot. Also just want to reiterate my support for models that allow for options. I would say in the conversations that I've been having with cities, because I too am very much interested in making sure that this is something that cities can kind of buy into and implement, and that helps them. In conversations that I've been having, that choice is really key. So that kind of flexibility piece, while also getting a lot of feedback, especially from more kind of capacity strapped cities, that as well, having a very clear framework to pick from is very helpful for them as well too, both just in terms of capacity, but also politics and engagement of their communities and things like that. That's just been a positive, while not wanting to have just these singular, this is what you must do, because as we all know, there is no one size fits all. Well, I guess I shouldn't say we all know. I think most of us would agree that there's no one size fits all for these things. And so just kind of want to add on to that. Also just want to kind of swing back to the previous discussion with, again, those different levels of ARAs. And again, I kind of am seeing a place for each of those levels across these different tools. So for example, if we keep the kind of cleaned up version of the universal list, which I know we're all interested in, but I think that could stay relatively level 1-ish, and kind of just be some general ideas, but that get tagged, to Mac's point, where we can kind of pull off that list as a guiding document. Where if we're starting to lean more towards safe harbors or even minimum requirements, to me, those get closer to at least a level 2, if not a level 3, because that's kind of the point of those, is some efficiency, some clarity, some really clear objectivity. So that at least is how I'm kind of been framing it in my head. And again, just thanks for all of the work that you've done to help define it, to I think help provide kind of a cleaner way to have this discussion.
Thank you for that, Julia, and thanks for the encouragement. I saw lots of hearts and thumbs up and heads nodding, and I'm sure the team appreciates the go team go attitude. So really appreciate that, and also the content of your comments, of course. I'm going to take the next three questions. We're going to take a break, and in that break, I'm going to decide where we go from there. But in the meantime, please, Anne, go ahead.
Yeah, I really appreciate Julia's comments and Mac's comments and all the comments. I was just wondering if it would be helpful for the team to have cities that have actually used the list and gone through it to kind of provide our comments on these and whether they're level 1, 2, or 3, because I mean, and a lot of these we've already done, we've had to do because of state laws or we're in the process of doing and stuff. I just wonder if that would be helpful because the list is really, really long and we do need a lot of options so that we have things that work in our own cities. But at the same time, there's some things that maybe just aren't in the city's wheelhouse, and I mean, they can be sorted out or just categorized differently. I don't know if any of that kind of input would be helpful if cities had time to sort of provide feedback from what's working in our own communities out of the tools that we've already adopted in moving the housing needle in production. Because yeah, a lot of them, like Brock said, aren't necessarily causing any more production, just like a lot of the HAPO stuff is not causing any production, so yeah.
That might be something we need to get back to you on, Anne, but I'll just take a moment and see if any of the staff have an immediate thought.
We certainly welcome all of that kind of input to make best use of your time, and I might encourage you to wait maybe another couple months, only because we will be refining that list regardless, and it might be, like I said, be a better use of your time to maybe give feedback once there is more cleanup and refinement done, but absolutely. And just for one more revisiting of timeline, because of biennial cycles and the constraints that come with that, we're looking to get drafts of a compliance pathway and adoption ready actions completed by the end of June. However, we do have until the end of the year to complete the rulemaking. And the revision of the HPS menu as it is, if it doesn't end up being in rule, if it's guidance, we do have some flexibility on refining that as well. And seeing as at the moment it's guidance, we have shelved some of that workload for later in the year. So that might also paint a clear picture about where we are with it, when you all can expect to see it getting more cleaned up and sorted. And we certainly welcome input at any time on what's in there and what is helpful or most effective.
Thank you. Michael.
Hey, to reply to Ariel and some of the other city folks a while back about which level of requirement is accurate. I think we have a useful tool here, and that is the difference between the HPS and the Housing Acceleration Program. The accountability step is already defined as like, if you are empirically failing, there's a pretty high bar to meet these targets, then there's an additional level of specificity that you might need to be subject to. That I could imagine that being like the more right side of the chart is used in that context, and the more left side of the chart is used in the other context, as one way to resolve the concerns that Brock and others raise. And my other point about to Rachel and maybe to Anne's comments about specificity, flexibility, wanting to actually produce, to defend liberalized zoning codes, my favorite subject. An effective liberalized zoning code is very flexible and allows small lot detached homes, and it may also allow multifamily codes. And I think that could be one of the ways to increase the flexibility that leads to production.
Great, thank you. Two more hands, and then I think we all just need a break away from the screen for a moment. But go ahead, Brock.
Yeah, and I'll try to be quick. apologize. Maybe saying off the table was not the right way to do that. I can understand definitely how there are times where having something that's, more or less cut and paste ready is going to be helpful for cities to do. But as far as it comes to rule language, right, what that sounds like to me is that even with the, rebuttable presumption of the minimum let me start with the minimum compliance standard here. That also exists in CFEC. Right, I think it's rule 320, subsections 8 and 9, 8 being the prescriptive, here's what you're going to do path, 9 being the, okay, you got to hit this kind of same target, right? And here's the flexibility. As far as I'm aware, and unless things have changed, there is not a single city that has gone with the optional path. It is too high of a bar for them to meet. So that almost guarantees that if we say, okay, rebuttable presumption, here's what you're going to do, that's what we're going to get. That brings us to the next point, which is once we get through the first planning cycle, if everybody's been required to do the same thing and it's working for some and it's not working for others, or it's working but not enough for some, what's the next step? If this is in rule language, this is what you have to do. Where do we go from there? Because then you have to come back and revise the rule every time once a city or a local government has done the required action. If it's still not enough, well, now you have to go back and revise the rule. And do you take the first requirement out and say, okay, now that everyone's done this, that's gone, and we're going to say this is the new requirement, or does it stay in there? And if it stays in there, then what we're getting back into is the exact situation we're trying to get out of, where we're saying this is what you will do to produce housing, and we're not seeing results. And so that's the kind of point that I'm trying to get across with this, is that it is just incredibly difficult to see a reliable pathway forward with minimum standards, even to a certain extent with the rebuttable presumptions just being written into rule at all. It makes for a really, really hard long-term fix to the problem that we're trying to do. Whereas if we give cities the flexibility to say, okay, here's your list, right? Here's the things that you might choose from, and give them the option to choose, right? Then cities have a way forward every time, because if something's not working, they can try something additional. They can do something they haven't done before. But with that minimum compliance standard, with the rebuttable presumption, that's mostly just what you're going to get. And then there's a problem once we get into cycles 2, 3, 4.
Thank you for adding some additional detail to things that need to be considered. Really appreciate that. Garland, last comment before the break. Oh, are you there?
So yeah, I am just struggling with the interface. It seemed like there was some confusion as to why there might be strategies that preserve existing supply, and maybe folks haven't worked with segmented market studies before. So I just wanted to break down how that works and why it's important to protect existing supply, even when you're thinking about housing production. So a segmented market study says, you have a need today for, say 50 low-income housing units, but you only have 20. So then looking out to the future, you're actually going to add 30 more low-income people. So you need to plan for 80 8 years from now, right? Well, but you already have some. Now, if you lose the ones that you have, then you need to build more. So if you have a housing strategy that includes preserving existing affordable housing units, then that reduces the amount that you need to build. That's why housing preservation strategies are actually an important part of housing production, because it reduces the delta, reduces the amount of new units that you have to construct to build out of the ground. I've seen our legislature misunderstand this. I just heard a mayor misunderstand this, as well as a representative of the Oregon Realtors. And so I think we really need to understand, like as a group and in the rule, why housing preservation is an important part of housing strategy, including housing production. But preservation and production go hand in hand. And if you lose some of your existing supply by income segment, that increases the amount that you need to construct for that income segment. And if you're talking about the lowest income segment, that increases the amount of housing subsidy that you have to source that you may not be able to do.
Thank you, Garland. Seeing lots of nodding heads and thumbs up and appreciation for that comment. So with that, let's take a break. We had one more question that was related to this, specific to Housing Acceleration Program on the agenda. I think we'll take that right after the break and just spend a couple minutes and make sure we didn't miss something there before we go on to our final discussion. Let's come back at 11:05, so 11:05. Please, see you in a few. All right. We're about ready to come back together. If those of you who are here could just turn on your camera at least for a moment so I can see that we have enough folks here, that would be great. Wonderful. Thank you. Appreciate that. Great. And then I just put eye drops in and I can't see anything. That was bad timing. Anyway, that'll clear in a moment here. Hi all. Glad you're here. I saw your flashing cameras turn on. I think what would be good, we have 55 minutes left in our meeting. We have some big conversation to have still. We've already started getting at some of it, and we're going to drill down into some details. But before we make that pivot into the details about actions, I want to close the loop on a question that is in the agenda at the top of page 3 that is similar to the conversation we were just having about compliance pathways, but specific to the Housing Acceleration Program. And a reminder for those of you, again, newer to the process, Housing Acceleration Program is the part that happens after a housing production strategy is adopted and cities begin to implement. There's a midpoint reporting, there's tracking of what's being produced. There's the potential of a city to be referred to the Housing Acceleration Program if they're struggling to meet their targets for housing production and affordability and choice. And so I just want to check in and see about thoughts you all may have about those different compliance pathway elements and how they could or maybe couldn't apply within that housing acceleration framework. And specifically thinking about that, again, that balance between, you know, identifying specific local barriers to housing production, affordability, and choice, and then also some certainty for cities that find themselves in the need to be part of the acceleration program. So thoughts, especially those of you, I think there's a few of you that sat on the Housing Acceleration Technical Advisory Committee last year. You might have some additional thoughts as it relates to this. Are your comments from the discussion we just had much different under the guise of housing acceleration versus housing production strategy? Again, are there some minimum standards you can imagine being more applicable in housing acceleration than in the planning process or vice versa? Julia, thank you.
Yeah. I kind of want to just, I don't know, reiterate or lean into a little bit the comment that Michael was making earlier about I personally, the way I see this in my mind is that there's a level of continuity between lists or pathways that are provided in the HPS and the acceleration program. But once you get into the acceleration program, I think that there needs to be a higher level of expectation or harder line that gets drawn in the line somewhere. And that could be either through a more detailed version of some of those lists in terms of, you know, kind of the ARAs, or an abbreviated list that is kind of like a definitive, this is what will be expected of you if you push us this far kind of a thing. And with the idea that hopefully no cities ever actually get there, but to Michael's point that he makes so well so often, that by having that on the horizon, and I mean that as a compliment, Michael, that having that on the horizon, that then can prompt action earlier, right? Like if a city sees that this is where we will inevitably end up if we don't do XYZ, that then helps them, again, have that kind of leverage, be it politically, capacity-wise, or whatever they need to actually get motivated to do what they need to do earlier. So that's my kind of personal take on it. I don't know that I necessarily have like a definitive list of what would be different or a different focus in the different stages just yet, because I feel like that's maybe a little bit deeper in the weeds than I've gone in that thought process, but just in terms of the framework as a whole, that's kind of how I've been thinking about it.
That's helpful. Thank you, Julia. Brock.
Yeah, high level, I agree with Julia. It makes much more sense to have more stringent compliance standards in the acceleration program because you are there because you didn't achieve the outcomes that you need to achieve. So I think, you know, having rebuttable presumption kind of be the starting point there is a better way or a more appropriate place for it than in the HPS. And maybe it's something that escalates, right? So if you get referred for, failure to produce enough housing under 80% AMI, the first time you have to do either this or you can do your own that demonstrates about the same impact, right? If you come back again 6 years later because you still haven't made any progress, maybe that's where it escalates to more like a minimum standard.
Okay, thank you, Michael.
Just a super quick clarification. It would be 12 years later, is that right? Because you can't be referred twice in a row? Yeah, he says yes. Okay, great. So I worry about that kind of a delay being built in the process in that situation that Brock just described, but otherwise I take the point.
All right, any other thoughts? Yeah, Anne.
Yeah, I was in the housing acceleration or accountability group, and I'm thinking, yeah, because of lack of performance in adopting the actions in your housing production strategy, that then maybe you'd move to a minimum standard where you have to adopt, if you didn't already adopt, you need to try certain additional measures. And I mean, in our discussions, there is sort of a work program, and the city and DLCD work together to identify why wasn't there, adoption of whatever you need to do and moving the target. So I feel that if it's a collaborative effort, we shouldn't be as scared about having some minimum standards in that accountability piece.
Yeah, just sort of providing that baseline, like if you're here, have you done all of these things? And then we'll go on from there. And I think the language and the question sort of providing a predictable statewide backstop to commonly needed actions. Okay, I'm seeing some nodding heads. And I think I've heard, at least from a few of you now, and we also have heard last year that, that is a place that could accommodate minimum standard, maybe better than some of the other parts of the program. In y'all's opinion, to be clear. Okay, great. I'm going to move us along then to our final discussion. That's the one on the agenda that's after the break, discussion number 3. And this is really focusing in on, as we're thinking about compliance pathways, sort of specific outcomes and objectives that could be met with each of these compliance pathways. There are sort of 3 general questions under there. One is which housing, and I'm sure Celestine will paste them in the chat for us, which housing outcomes or policy objectives do you think are most appropriate to address through a minimum standard for compliance? And before we go there, the next one, which do you think are best suited for safe harbor? And then, what are the trade-offs related to those racial equity framework discussion points, especially around benefits burdens and accountability items. So let's start with minimum standard for compliance. I know I heard Matt already bring up one idea that we've heard about before, which is the potential for minimum standard for compliance for something around accessible housing and action to advance producing more housing units that have accessibility features or are fully accessible. But let's talk about others you think, or other types of housing outcomes or policy objectives you think are well suited for minimum standard for compliance. Any others? And we just talked about some which may be more appropriate in housing acceleration program than in HPS planning. Yeah, Julia.
Yeah, I mean, echo Matt's note around accessibility. And then with that, I don't know that I necessarily have other specific examples, but I would just be curious to kind of think through things in the framework that Matt has brought up related to accessibility, meaning what other areas of requirements or in my mind kind of more specifically equity issues, are going to be harder for cities to both fully understand just due to challenges either in quantitative data as well as just, again, wanting to be thoughtful around engagement fatigue in terms of qualitative data. And with that, are there areas, again, where we feel like that kind of shared floor across the state would really be a benefit to just ensure that everyone's kind of moving forward, in spite of maybe the data not being able to tell the whole story. So to me, that's kind of whenever I'm bringing up minimum standards, that's kind of where I see it playing a role in the HPS side of things, is just kind of as this like safety net for just challenges around getting good information, even for cities that really want to. We've heard that from cities, I think, across the board, just in terms of some concern around their ability to get all of the data points that we're asking of them rightfully, but what can we do to kind of help them along in terms of having some baseline expectations, at least, is what I see those as. And then again, yeah, on the accountability side, I see that more as a hard line in the sand, in terms of if they've just blatantly kind of either not achieved their goals or just severely failing on a certain front. That's where I kind of see more of a minimum standard on the accountability side.
Again, that backstop sort of level, yeah. I guess I'd put the question too to cities, especially those of you who have been through the process of action selection recently. Are there any areas in those discussions and sort of process you had that you think would have been helpful to just have a minimum standard that you can move forward on? And then similarly, for those of you who build housing, develop housing, design housing, are there things you wish cities would just be doing outright that might be a minimum standard that could help with production, affordability, choice? Not possible. Anne, thank you.
Well, we did try to move the needle on accessible housing, for example, and the process to exceed the state building code is a little bit cumbersome, according to our building official. And so I feel like, I mean, I'm getting into the weeds on a specific issue, but if there are obstacles in other agencies or codes to achieving, to adopting, that we have to get over that hurdle and that timeline, we're less inclined to have, require something at the local level. If we have to get the state building official person's approval to exceed the building code standards for accessibility, for example. The other would be like houses on wheels. I mean, there's some building code issues there. So, I mean, this is kind of getting back to what are level 1s, 2s, and 3s. And I think if we're looking at accountability, we need to make sure there are a lot of level 1s, or, there are state resources to help us, remove some of those barriers and obstacles to things that might actually move the needle, like on accessibility. It's maybe off topic, but those are just my thoughts. And looking through some of the lists, we would love for us to be able to do more, but if it takes a lot of work and another agency, it makes it really challenging.
Yeah, and I think you're fully on topic. It is a one of the major sort of policy objectives, is thinking through accessible housing. And Celestina, yeah, if you could share those again one more time, I think that would be super helpful. And I think that just to ground us again on some of the things we're solving for a lot, as you all know. But reground us on some of the policy objectives we're solving for in this conversation.
Yeah, and I thought I might pull up the
Thank you.
larger document just for a moment. The high level summary headers are helpful, certainly for PowerPoint, and just to touch on them, but just to unpack a little bit more some of these questions about which of these areas do we feel like could warrant each level of compliance pathway tool, whether it's safe harbor or minimum standard or rebuttable presumption. I heard that, there's more work related to rebuttable presumption, so maybe not a lot of interest there, but whichever ones are jumping out at you, we've heard, like Deb said, about accessibility, but for example, anti-displacement policies and policies that address past and current harms, like how are y'all conceptualizing that we might be able to provide compliance pathway on that? Or a diversity of housing types, characteristics, and locations. We've talked about accessibility generally, but not specifically orienting to high opportunity areas or affordable housing in high opportunity areas or lower opportunity areas. And then I'll just scroll for a moment to get to the other few items here. Streamlining housing development processes, reducing regulatory barriers. Do you have a sense of what compliance pathway tool might be suited to achieve that outcome? And then increasing community capacity, resilience, local efficiency of resources, and reducing risk. So if helpful, that is a quick overview of our policy objectives.
Thank you for the reminder. There's a lot in there, and I put in the chat the link to that document, just so it's easy access there that Celestina was just going over. Brock, go ahead.
Yeah, and I agree with Anne. There's definitely some things where, like with accessibility, as a lot of people have mentioned today, where that kind of minimum compliance standard is more appropriate. Combining that with the question of like, what should cities be doing to enable production? Like, what should cities be required to do to enable production? To a certain extent, I think, like the example that Anne brought up, some of that is beyond the scope of ARAs and this rulemaking, and it's going to require legislative action. The difficulty with going above code for accessibility, that's a statutory issue that we need to address. And so just to note that some of these things would probably require different authorization, different support from the legislature, things like that to get done.
Thank you, Brock. Alan?
I'm going to actually build on this because we're in the middle of the legislative session with some of this stuff actively being discussed. And so there might be some solutions that we come to in the coming months that address some of these actions. And I'm going to ask this question and hope Matt Sayers is kind of here listening to this, because I feel like his reaction might be the best. Is a safe harbor a best way to go with respect to accessibility? I think one of the challenges that we're seeing when we look at the building code is that we have this mini-max code, and that our building codes division is interpreting that as fair housing says we have to cap accessibility standards and can't go above that, where we think fair housing standards are actually saying build more accessible housing and you can go beyond that. So there's a disconnect with what the building code officials are saying. So I'm not sure if the safe harbor approach is better when we would articulate, here's what we see with respect to fair housing law and our building code. And then I'd say that the other piece that's in legislation right now to think about is this modular housing innovation that Representative Marsh is working on. Because one of the add-ons that we're hoping, or an amendment that we're hoping, is that some of those modular units are built with a plumbing insert that would allow for accessibility to happen in the future. It would not, currently the way that some of those plumbing inserts are built do not allow for accessible housing to kind of move forward. So again, a legislative fix that we're hoping will open up more options for folks. And then I'm going to land here on some work that I've done in the past, which is around this high opportunity areas or 15-minute to 20-minute neighborhoods. In my opinion, as a content expert urban gerontologist, I feel like our 15 to 20-minute neighborhoods or our high opportunity neighborhoods should be planning for families, people with disabilities, older adults, and caregivers, essentially as the common denominator, because those environments will work for everybody. But when we don't include those populations, they don't work for those vulnerable populations. And so I'm not sold that we're only putting people in high opportunity areas, that we still have pathways to develop, like in Portland, our corridors or our main streets to be more other high opportunity areas. But I just feel like that those types of high opportunity areas are the best places to start with accessible, close distance amenities, housing, and services that work for people who we're really trying to address. We've got an aging population, we've got an increase in disabilities. These are parts of our housing production strategy. They're parts of our needs analyses, even with a gap in our knowledge on existing accessible units. we've got to be planning proactively for those groups. So anyways, I think my big point is we've got some stuff in the legislature now being considered that might unlock things moving forward.
That's helpful. Thank you so much, Alan. And keep us posted as things move along there as well for those who might not be following along. I'm actually going to hop over to Matt really quick because I know he has given some thoughts about accessible units and the sort of compliance construct in the past. So Matt, go ahead. Oh, you're muted. Of course. Yeah.
Thanks for teeing me up there, Alan. I appreciate it. I think in answer to the specific questions about whether safe harbors is the best strategy, I think it goes back to that issue of, well, what's the right compliance strategy for, or what's the right compliance mechanism for a specific issue? I think where an action requires cooperation from a state agency in order to make it be effective or to implement it, that may be an area where a safe harbor makes more sense. I could see the logic there. However, I think the flip side of it in terms of DLCD and kind of like what I would say are some hurdles that they place in granting exemptions to the state building code would be, if it's a minimum requirement of a housing acceleration program that a city implement a certain change, a local change to their state building code, that may divest DLCD of the discretion to deny that exemption because it's required. And that's a legal question. And I don't have the answer to that right now. But I do think that it does potentially give cities smoother sailing in terms of getting those exemptions approved by DLCD if they're actually required, or even if they are part of their contextualized housing to contextualize needs analysis. If their contextualized housing need shows that they need a certain number of type A units that the building code can't provide, then that makes a strong case for DLCD to grant that exemption, and perhaps they have to grant that exemption. So I do think that it doesn't necessarily require a statutory change for cities to approach DLCD with those requests for exemption, and DLCD may not always have the discretion to deny them. So
Matt, you have said a couple of times now, I just want to clarify DLCD request for exemption. I think maybe you meant Building Codes Division, or did you mean DLCD?
Right. I meant DCBS. I got my
okay, that's fine. All the
DCBS.
alphabet soup. Yes. Okay. I just wanted to make sure I was tracking your conversation well.
Yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, you're not asking that from DLCD, but I think another minimum requirement action that is more clearly within like land use planning and not building codes are things like density requirements. And minimum density requirements are a way to get at accessibility because higher density buildings are the only ones that are currently required to have accessible units. Single family homes don't require them at all. So, that could be another area where a minimum requirement may be useful.
Thank you. Very helpful insights, Matt, and some interesting ideas to keep pondering here. Julia, thanks for waiting.
Yeah, no problem. And I, as expected, Matt started to hit on one of the points that I just wanted to briefly make as a general note, but also I guess in the context of this accessibility conversation. I'm going to channel Shannon from Habitat, who I think has dropped off the meeting, and hopefully I will not misrepresent her words here, but I just want to encourage us all to remember that we don't just have to do regulatory actions, we can do incentive-based actions too. And so that can involve things like what Matt was saying, which is kind of a soft regulatory action in terms of density, which then opens the door for potential densities that then trigger things like building code, but also things like pre-approved accessible ADU plans or FAR bonuses if you're doing accessible units above the minimum requirements. Those types of things can have a lot of power for making things happen as well. So I just want to throw that into the mix when we're thinking about adoption ready actions.
Appreciate that. Appreciate you opening the door to some more creativity around this. Michael.
I've been thinking about Brienne's good point earlier about how model codes are more complicated than they may seem. And so specifically on that subject, it seems to me that some of the logistical or some of the problem with that might be resolved by creating a process by which DLCD agrees that any particular zone that already exists in a city is fundamentally compliant with, at least as liberal as the state model code. And then sort of you say, yes, this piece fits into this piece, and this zone is considered compliant with this model code. I would wonder what the city folks think about that. But anyway, that might ease some of the barriers we're talking about here in that situation.
Having more of a map about how you get from one to the other in the compliance.
Right, which would need to be somewhat discretionary and unique to each city, and so therefore part of the HPS like acceptance process, possibly. I'm not sure, but that is my thinking. I don't know.
Got it. Brock.
Yeah, I chiming in with Matt and Julia and channeling Shannon. I agree. Yeah, the incentive tools are going to be good as well. As far as minimum density, off the bat, that makes me nervous. I think something more to the effect of like, hey, you have to have this much zone capacity that would support density requirements that trigger the accessibility requirements. But like across the board, minimum density is a hard line.
Okay. Garland?
Yeah, so I also want to follow up on the model code thread. I think when we did our Miro board, there was a lot of thumbs up for the form-based code option, but I'm concerned that that thread is dangling in the wind, flapping and going nowhere, unless we tie it to the model code. And in particular, I'm concerned that right now we might be on a path to produce a non-form-based model code, when I think we can already acknowledge that non-form-based zoning codes are exactly what got us into this mess. So why would we double down on that as our model code? Shouldn't we instead develop a budget and a plan to produce a statewide model form-based code for Oregon? And if we did so, there's already a high watermark to pivot from. It's the SMART code, it's open source, it's the only model form-based code that's open source that is available to pivot from. And there's a certain set of practitioners who are certified and working with the SMART code. So I would recommend us strongly exploring that path. It's the obvious path, but I just want to daylight that right now we're kind of on a collision course with disaster if we're planning to produce a non-form-based model code when we've already said, hey, a form-based code is what we think we should be steering towards.
Okay, our next meeting next week, we'll be digging deeply into the model code and elements of model code. And we can definitely sort of unpack that. But Sean, briefly, do you have anything? Oh, you're muted.
Sorry, just a extra layer. Garland, this is actually one of the themes that we've heard and have been pondering and reflecting on. We're actually going to build on that discussion next week, and form-based codes is one of the topics of discussion. So there'll be plenty more time to nerd out on the model code, and so don't worry, it's not falling through the cracks.
Yeah, great, thank you. Anne, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I was thinking about a strategy that we were considering before middle housing, and that is something Corvallis and I think McMinnville does, and maybe other cities, is requiring a mix of housing types within residential developments, especially in your lower density zones, but not just a mix, but a mix of sizes and types. That way you can tailor that standard to whatever your housing capacity analysis has said. Anyway, there's some challenges with, is the middle housing really infill or not infill? And we've kind of got the massive greenfield middle housing going on here, but it's something that I thought would be a strategy that really could be tailored to all city sizes. And that would result, because housing variety and choice in all areas of our city is what we're striving for. And unless you do something like that, you could end up with, 10 acres of townhouses and, maybe not the type of housing that you need, accessible or other.
Not meeting the full variety of housing needed. I want to just thank you. I'm seeing a couple of nodding heads. I want to sort of query those of you who build housing, developers or design housing, your thoughts on things you are sort of struggling with, the barriers you're hitting in doing that would be helpful if cities were required or encouraged. I'm not sure which pathway to sort of remove said barriers. So Gust, thank you.
Yeah, hello everyone. I appreciated the conversations today. It's really interesting to hear from the cities. I'm not sure if we have a small city involved in this, but it's a different perspective. Hopefully one of us is a small city, speaking from their perspectives. But I think from my perspective, kind of looking at it from a builder developer, it seems like having the cities have flexibilities is one of the key things. I mean, all the things we're discussing today seems like we could be, the majority of us could be convinced to see one side or the other of it. There's just pros and cons to a lot of it. And so I feel like being able to kind of drip that down to what seems like it's most well-rounded, and then moving forward, I guess trying to find a way to say that just taking some specific actions, but also giving some flexibility within those actions, knowing that when we do choose, it's not like we've written this in stone forever, and there's going to be some revisions that are going to come with it in the future, and not being afraid of making that step. I'm involved in a development in Umatilla County right now, where we've got a project manager, an owner, architect, and we're just mired down in things that can't seem to come to a point where we can make progress. And so I make a living building and developing. And when that's hindered, it really rears its head. And so I just think that having the ability for cities to make that simple, I am curious how, when we talk about cities requiring a certain type of build, how do we actuate that? How does the city actuate that foundation being put in the ground? I have a piece of ground in LeGrand that has high density requirement, and I think there's about 2 acres there, and they're requiring us to put about 23 units on it, which is going to require vertical stacked construction of some type. I don't want to bite that off right now with the way the economy is, the risk, the insurances, all these things playing against it. I do like the fact that they have that in place, but it's keeping that piece of ground in my control from being built on. So I'm just wondering about flexibilities, latitudes in that with cities. But I really just think being flexible and moving forward is critical, and finding ways that cities can encourage that. And I know that's very broad, but those are my thoughts.
Super helpful, Gust. Thank you for sharing your thoughts and some of the examples and struggles you butt up against from time to time. Anyone else have some examples from the field that can help illuminate this discussion a little bit more? Yeah, Anne, go ahead.
Well, just to talk about a potential requirement to require a mix of housing types and sizes. I mean, it kind of correlates a little bit with minimum densities, but minimum densities, you could end up with all of the same unit type and not have the variety that you might need from your developer. But Gus, to your point, like Corvallis has a requirement that you have 3 housing types or something like that, and at least 10% or 20% have to be. You get to pick which ones the developer gets to pick which ones they're going to do. But one type has to at least be 20%, and the next type has to be 20% or something like that, and then the rest could be whatever you want. And then if that was in combination with the minimum density, I mean, you would need to figure stuff out. But we've had huge demand, supposedly. It's not getting built yet, for really small detached housing, which can be accessible because it's if it's 1 story. And so that's where I kind of cringe at. I mean, you can still meet a minimum density of 15 units in that acre in the secondary CFAs for us, and that's all going to be fine. But I do think that flexibility to really address the market and what can be financed is a really good point. And then what your community says it needs and wants, it's not being built in your marketplace.
Yeah, thank you, Anne. That's super helpful. Cassidy, just 1 second. Gus, did you have some additional thoughts to tag on there?
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to say the model code thing is a tough nut to crack, but I do like having a model code and even coupling that with a model set of plans that might be usable for, like in our situation, we're working with multiple stakeholders in the community to provide a pilot program where we create modular cottage home development, which is scalable, starting with 4 units, going to 8 or whatever it may be. That has the plans, the zoning requirements intact, and you just serve it up like pizza to a community, and they can take that and scale it to their need, but having it be have a process where it could be streamlined and accepted quickly, and then use the different either manufactured homes or, in our case, cottage homes, but have that be teed up and ready to be expedited. So it could be used in very, very rural communities or not. So just an idea that I had.
Thank you. Yeah, some of the path is not just minimal requirements for what could be used on the land, but how those permits or development agreements get expedited. Cassidy, please go ahead.
I raised my hand, just to be honest, mostly because I felt like I was supposed to, as the sort of market rate developer representative here today. And I also need to admit that over the past hours, we've got really deep into these details. I've lost the beat a little bit, but I can say that maybe speaking in concert with Gust is sort of maybe on the opposite side of the spectrum of where I sit in the development world, where usually in our case, more density improves a project, because in a market rate development, when we're trying to build at scale and in an urban core, we're relying on investment capital that expects a return, on their investment and the risk associated with it. And so usually when we can provide speed and certainty of entitlement and more units, usually my pro forma works better when I have more units, and usually my capital's happier if I can provide some speed and certainty of permitting and getting to construction start. So I think we do need to keep that in mind as we start to figure out how we're going to structure these sort of adoption ready actions, or I guess we're revolving the words we're using to describe what we're doing. But as we evolve these, I think, yes, flexibility is key, but also adding more time and complexity and uncertainty in the outcome of what I might be allowed to do isn't helpful if we're just trying to juice production, and things that lower the potential yield, as we would call it, a unit yield per acre, isn't helpful. So that's my thoughts as the market rate person in the room.
Really appreciate that, Cassidy. Thank you for stepping forward. Mac.
I would also like to underline that, but from the affordable end of the spectrum, higher density does also really help us. And for our purposes, the net outcome is the same, but the driver of why that is a little bit different. At least for us, to get predominantly anything built that's going to be affordable to folks at 80% AMI, certainly at lower AMI levels than that, is that we have subsidy limits that the state has for us. So that means the land value can only be a certain amount per unit. And if you're looking to build in a high opportunity area where land values are higher, you're going to need a higher unit count to bring that down below sort of the threshold is needed to make the whole project pencil. As well as, I know we've talked about this in the space before, but about 40 units per site is generally sort of the minimum that is needed for LIHTC development. And LIHTC is, again, the builder of 98% of affordable housing in this country. Maybe not that exact percentage, but very close there too. And so in addition to just the development penciling, it also achieves certain staff efficiencies for us because we're required to provide services, having on-site property management. That 40-unit threshold, you can hire at least a half-time person, which is much easier to hire than a 0.2 or a 0.3 FTE. And so that sort of baseline density and ensuring that that can be met is really important. I also would underline the entitlements and getting through the permitting process, and that predictability for us is really important because we have a less ability to weather increased escalation from the time cost of money in waiting to build, as well as our funding generally comes with deadlines of you need to break ground within a certain amount of time or your funding could get pulled. And then as a nonprofit, our several $1 million that it now takes to get a project through pre-development is at risk. And we have to bear that budget when often small nonprofits cannot bear to pay back that $2 million without severely curtailing their services and not shutting the organization. I don't mean to speak in hyperbole there. It's just, it is a real reality for organizations like mine. Thank you.
Thanks, Mac. Really important. I mean, both you and Cassidy have sort of pointed out those monetary pressures of the sort of process, and Gus too, the process of permitting and or not expediting some of these decisions at the local level have real cost impacts. It's a little different for subsidized affordable housing, but they both have cost impacts and potentially impacts on whether a project moves forward or not. Anne.
Yeah, so I just wanted to clarify when I brought up the suggestion for a mix of housing types, I was talking about your like lower density zones, but yes, make sure for your higher density areas where your high opportunity areas, your mixed use areas and your climate friendly areas or wherever, no density maximums. I mean, we're already implementing that. It's really down to the market for how tall they're willing to build and making sure heights aren't in the way of those. But with the state law for residential and affordable housing, you've got height bonuses and stuff like that already in place. Cities have those adopted, but what can we do to streamline the process? I mean, I feel like we're pretty quick in Albany, but I do think, making sure cities don't have any maximum density limits in these areas. And then, what's an appropriate minimum height allowance for cities of different sizes and different areas, and your transition, some of the design standards, like your transition between higher density and lower density can also be limiting in what you can actually build on a site, whether you can use the full site capacity and lot coverage. So some of those strategies, action readies might be helpful in ensuring you can get to the 40 units an acre or whatever it is you need to for market.
Thank you for the additional thoughts on that. I'm going to take these two more, acknowledging we have 10 minutes left. We've mostly answered all the questions, but I think we'll have to determine whether that's true. But please, Rachel, I know you have some thoughts about the funding side of things, or I imagine you do.
Yeah, thanks. So I just want to acknowledge that I am not a developer, so I have different lens that I'm looking at things through. But I think some of the things that we have as a lender seen as hindrances to funding, and specifically for affordable, because that is the realm that I work in, is there is a lot of bureaucratic. Sorry, I'm trying to be very careful here. There's a lot of steps to go through in order to get funding through the finish line. That is in some cases unique to Oregon. It's not standard throughout all 50 states, and all 50 states have a different process. In addition to that, just going to acknowledge here that, like letters of intent that I put together 6 months ago, and I'm still working on the deal, don't apply pretty much in any way to what I have to structure the deal as to close it now. So, current hindrances are the economic climate. Ongoing hindrances I see are the setup in Oregon specifically to get things through to come to fruition quickly. And also there are a lot of new pressures on especially smaller not-for-profit developers with new program rollout that has been implemented that create a lot of expenses for developers to hold property and create a plan for development that is pretty much action ready and ready to break ground, which is great for expediency, but not great for the smaller developers who need to hold land or do a lot of pre-development for a very long time, and that's very, very expensive. So I think there was a lot of good effort behind that, but I think in practice maybe it's a little bit less effective than we hope for. And I know we don't have a lot of control over that here, but I did want to point it out.
But thank you for that. And it's just nice to know where those other pressures are, and being mindful of those as we're sort of trying to remove maybe other barriers to make more room for the ones that we don't have control over. Mac, last comment, and then we'll move to wrap up here.
Yeah, thank you so much. I want to plus one a lot of what Rachel just said. I really appreciate her call out of that. And yes, just plus one to that. One other dynamic I think I at least also want to name as a pressure, and it's also a pressure that's mostly, I think, outside the scope of ONA. But just to speak to some of the experience that we've had in development recently, land use has not necessarily really been my pinch point in a city review process. It's been the engineering departments. Land use has a set sort of time of, once you start a land use process, it has a certain amount of days that it needs to be completed within, which is great. Engineering and building permit reviews do not have that. And so I think I just want to kind of underline for jurisdictions in general that we've done a lot of really great things in the state related to land use, and I'm really proud of, and I'm really excited about that. There's other pieces related to engineering and building permit timeline reviews that still need to be addressed. I recognize there are a lot of challenges about that, workforce training, etc. But I also just want to really name that dynamic here as well.
Thank you. Good point. I know we heard that at the last meeting as well when we were talking about potential adoption ready actions. Celestina, do you want to start the wrap up here maybe?
Yes, exactly. I just wanted to name, because we thought about naming it earlier, but glad that we kept conversation going. And Mac, you're giving me the perfect segue that the housing production strategy and actions therein encompass beyond just the planning departments, encompass actions and invoke the city writ large. So those kinds of suggestions, are on the table, and in fact, we have a policy objective of streamlining processes. So I think that's right in line. And just to also name that other actions like anti-displacement policies and programs, those things that are not only purely production are also in the mix. So we thought about naming it earlier, and I figured I might name it now. And we've heard quite a few things across the board. So thank you all for wonderful, wonderful discussion today. I'll hand it back to you, Deb.
No, that's perfect. Thank you so much for that. So I just wanted to I thank you all for hanging in there. We have just a couple of minutes, but we like to do a couple of things at the end of these meetings. One is just kind of reflect on this discussion generally, and reflect on your needs in these discussions and how we can make these more effective. And we can also take that offline if you'd like to just reach out to me directly. And then especially check in on the racial equity framework sort of charge for the day, especially, and just sort of think about, did we do a good job at trying to really think about where those benefits and burdens are, how that impact sort of rolls out in the community at the community level, for people who already have housing disparities, and how can we do better with that? So I'll just kind of open it up with that question and see if anyone would like to venture on a reflection or two. Yeah, Alan, thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks, Deb. And one of the things I wanted to bring forward, and it goes back to the very beginning when we talked about kind of the template or the guidelines for the racial equity framework, and particularly when we talk about this definition of benefits and burdens, or the question about benefits and burdens. I think I want to remind folks that the dichotomy isn't between benefits versus burdens, because I think very often when we think about producing housing, we think there are lots of benefits that we're going to achieve from producing housing, and no one is burdened by more housing, right? So the question shouldn't be, are there benefits and are there burdens? The question is, who benefits and who doesn't? So we need to ask that in each case. Who benefits and who doesn't? Who is burdened and who is not burdened? I think when we think about the production of housing very often, or sometimes when we do, we think just more production is better, without the considerations around choice, around location, around those other things, right? We tend not to think about folks that will not benefit if we build in a certain way, and we also tend not to think that there are burdens, actual burdens to folks when we think that way, that production helps everybody. When that's just simply not true from an equity standpoint. It doesn't help everybody in the same way. And it goes back to kind of the point I made earlier about, I think my discussion about the policy objective around high priority areas does fit in when we look at the question about trade-offs for flexibility around benefits and burdens for less flexibility. And I think that is true when we look at if we create inflexible requirements around something like location related to high priority areas, the trade-off is the potential that we might actually create burdens for certain communities. I get that it actually is related to our need to coordinate with with community-friendly and equitable communities and the CFAs, but I think we also need to make sure that we are paying attention to the trade-offs, which was one of the questions today. So I think that discussion actually did fit in there today. It was just misplaced on the agenda for me. So I got to it earlier than later. So I think we have to do, obviously all of this is trade-offs and balances, but that's one that I hope we will consider a little bit more with regard to that particular aspect. So thanks, Deb.
Thank you, Alan. Always really appreciate your perspective, especially as you're sort of listening to the whole conversation here. Anyone else have thoughts on this question or want to add on to what Alan just said? Okay, anyone else ready to stand up? Because it's been a really long time that we've been sitting in front of our computers. With that, just a quick look ahead. We are meeting again next week, February 26th from 9 to 11. It's a 2-hour meeting. It will be 100% focused on the model code discussion. We'll be getting you an agenda in the next couple of days here with details on what that is and what that might look like. And it will be quite technical in nature. We are not offended and even encourage if you feel like you just aren't into model code and getting super nerdy on that, take a pass. Let us know if you're going to take a pass, just so we know. But we also warmly welcome your contributions as well. Thank you all for hanging in there. Really helpful discussion today, and we will keep advancing these, and we'll be bringing to you those more details on adoption-ready actions, compliance pathways, etc. All right. Have a good rest of your day.